The infantry regiments, taken unawares in the forest, had rushed out, and the companies, becoming confused one with another, had formed a demoralized mob. One soldier, in his panic, had shouted the senseless words so terrible in war, "Cut off!" And these words, with the accompanying panic, had spread through the whole troop. "Surrounded! Cut off! Lost!" cried the voices of the fugitives. The regimental commander, the moment that he heard the musketry and the shouting behind him, comprehended that something awful had happened to his regiment, and the thought that he, who had been during many years of service an exemplary officer, never guilty of any breach, might now be accused of negligence or faulty arrangements, came on him so keenly that, for the moment entirely forgetting the recalcitrant colonel of cavalry and his own importance as a general, and, above all, forgetting the peril and the impulse of self-preservation, he seized his saddle-bow and, spurring on his horse, dashed back toward the regiment under a shower of bullets falling all around him, but fortunately sparing him. He had only one desire, to find out what had occurred, to bring aid, and to repair the blunder if it were in any way to be attributed to him, and to escape all censure after his 22 years' service, in which his record as an officer had been blameless. Having fortunately spurred through the lines of the French unharmed, he came upon his regiment on the other side of the same forest through which our men had been running and scattering down the ravine, not heeding the word of command. That moment of moral vacillation had arrived which decides the fate of a battle. Would these scattered throngs of soldiers heed their commander's voice, or would they merely look at him and pursue their way? Notwithstanding the despairing shouts of their general, which had hitherto been so terrible to them, notwithstanding his infuriated, purple face, so unlike his ordinary appearance, and notwithstanding his brandished sword, the soldiers still persisted in their flight, shouted, fired their guns into the air, and paid no heed to the command. The moral balance, which decides the destiny of battles, had evidently kicked the beam on the side of panic. The general coughed, choking with the violence of his shouts and the gunpowder smoke, and reined in his horse in despair. All seemed lost. But at this moment the French, who had fallen upon our lines, suddenly, without any apparent reason, fell back and vanished behind the edge of the forest, and the Russian sharpshooters made their appearance. This was Timokhin's company, the only one in the woods which had preserved any semblance of order. Entrenching themselves in the ditch near the forest, they had unexpectedly attacked the French. Timokhin had thrown himself upon the enemy with such a desperate cry, and flourishing his rapier, had dashed after them with such frantic and rash energy that the French, before they had time to collect their wits, flung away their muskets and fled. Dólokhov, dashing on abreast of Timokhin, killed one Frenchman point blank, and was the first to seize the officer by the collar and make him surrender. The fugitives turned back, the battalions formed again, and the French, who had cut the left wing into two, were driven back in a trice. The reserves succeeded in uniting their forces. The fugitives were brought to a halt. The regimental commander was standing with Major Ekonomov by the bridge, watching the retreating companies file past him, when a soldier approached him, seized his stirrup, and almost leaned against him. This soldier wore a blue coat of broadcloth, without a knapsack or shako. His head was bound up, and over his shoulder he carried a French cartridge pouch. In his hand he held an officer's sword. This soldier was pale. His blue eyes looked boldly into the general's face, and a smile parted his lips. Although the general was engaged in giving directions to Major Ekonomov, he could not help noticing this soldier. "Your Excellency, here are 2 trophies," said Dólokhov, showing the French cartridge pouch and sword. "I took an officer prisoner with my own hand. I stopped the company." Dólokhov was all out of breath with fatigue. He spoke in broken sentences. "The whole company can bear me witness. I beg of you to remember it, Your Excellency." "Very good, very good," said the regimental commander, and he turned to Major Ekonomov. But Dolokhov did not pass on. He untied his handkerchief, pulled him by the sleeve, and called his attention to the clotted blood on his hair. "A bayonet wound. I was in the front. Remember, Your Excellency." Tushkin's battery had been entirely forgotten, and only at the very end of the engagement, Prince Bagration, still hearing cannonading at the centre, sent thither the first staff officer of the day, and then Prince Andrei, to order the battery to retire as speedily as possible. The covering forces, which had been stationed near Tushkin's cannon, had been withdrawn during the heat of the engagement by someone's orders, but the battery still continued to blaze away and had not been taken by the French, simply because the enemy could not comprehend the audacity of 4 guns continuing to fire after the supporting columns had been withdrawn. On the contrary, they supposed, from the energetic activity of this battery, that the principal forces of the Russians were here concentrated in the center, and twice they attempted to storm this point, and both times they were driven back by discharges of grape from these 4 cannon, standing alone on the hill. Shortly after Prince Bagration's departure, Tushin had succeeded in setting Schöngraben on fire. "See them scatter!" "It burns! See the smoke!" "Cleverly done!" "Splendid!" "The smoke! The smoke!" cried the gunners, growing excited. All the cannon had been directed, without special orders, in the direction of the fire. As though by one impulse the soldiers would cry out after every shot, "Cleverly done! That's the way to do it! See there! Admirable!" The fire, fanned by the wind, quickly spread. The French columns, retreating behind the village, fell back, but as though for a punishment for this misfortune, the enemy established a battery of 10 guns a little to the right of the village and began to reply to Tushin's fire. In their childish delight at setting the village on fire, and at their successful onslaught upon the French, our gunners did not notice this battery until 2 cannonballs, followed by 4 at once, fell among the guns. One of them knocked over 2 horses, and the other carried away the leg of the powder-master. The animation of the men, once aroused, was not dampened, however, but only changed in character. The horses were replaced by 2 others from the reserve, the wounded were removed, and the 4 cannon were turned against the 10-gun battery. An officer, Tushin's comrade, had been killed at the beginning of the action, and during the course of the hour, out of 40 men serving the guns, 17 were disabled, but still the gunners were jolly and full of energy. Twice they noticed that below and not far away from them the French were beginning to appear, and they had loaded with grape. The little captain, with his weak, awkward gestures, kept calling upon his deshnik for just one more little pipe, which he called tribachka instead of trubachka, and then, knocking the ashes out, he would leap forward and look from under his little hand at the enemy. "Let 'em have it, boys!" he would exclaim, and himself seizing the cannon by the wheel, he would bring it back into position, or he would clean out the bore. In the smoke, stunned by the incessant firing, though he jumped every time a gun went off, Tushin, keeping his nose-warmer between his teeth, ran from one gun to another, now aiming, now counting the charges left, now making arrangements for the change or removal of the killed or wounded horses, and shouting his orders in his weak, delicate, irresolute voice. His face kept growing more and more animated. Only when his men were killed or wounded did he frown, and, turning away from the unfortunate, shout sternly to the others, who, as usual, pressed forward, ordering them to carry away the wounded or the dead. The soldiers, for the most part, handsome young heroes, as always happens in the artillery, a couple of heads taller than their officer, and twice as broadly built, looked at their commander with the inquiring look of children in trouble, and the expression which happened to be in his face was immediately reflected in theirs. As a consequence of the terrible din and roar, and the necessity for oversight and activity, Tushin felt not the least unpleasant qualm of fear, nor did the thought that he might be killed or painfully wounded enter his head. On the contrary, he kept growing happier and happier. It seemed to him that it was very long ago, not even that same afternoon, since the moment when he first caught sight of the advancing enemy, and had fired the first gun, and that little scrap of ground where he stood had been long, long known and familiar to him. Although he remembered everything, took everything into consideration, did everything the best of officers could have done in his position, still he was in a state bordering on the delirium of fever or the condition of a drunken man. In the midst of the stunning sounds of his own guns roaring on every side of him, in the midst of the enemy's shells, whistling and striking around him, seeing his sweating, flushed men serving their guns, seeing the blood of men and horses, seeing the puffs of smoke in the direction of the enemy, followed always by the swift flight of the cannonball, striking into the ground, on a human being, on the guns, or among the horses, seeing all these various sights, still his mind was filled with a fantastic world of his own, which at this moment constituted a peculiar delight to him. The enemy's guns were in his imagination, not guns but pipes, from which, from time to time, a viewless smoker puffs out wreaths of smoke. "See there, he gave another puff," said Tushin, in a half-whisper to himself, just as a wreath of smoke leaped away from the hill and was borne to the left in a ribbon by the wind. "Now, let us catch the little ball and send it back." "What is your order, your honor?" asked a gunner who stood near him and noticed that he had muttered something. "Nothing. Send a shell," he replied. "Now then, our Matveyevna," he said to himself. It was the great, old-fashioned howitzer that Tushin personified under the name of Matveyevna, daughter of Matthew. The French around their guns reminded him of ants. Gunner No. 1 of the second field piece, a handsome fellow, too much given to drink, was Dyadya, uncle, in his world. Tushin looked at him oftener than the others, and delighted in all his movements. The sound of the musketry in the valley, now dying away and then increasing in violence, seemed to him like someone drawing long breaths. He listened to the intermittent rising and falling of these sounds. "Hark, she's breathing again, breathing hard," he said to himself. He imagined himself a mighty giant of monstrous size, seizing the cannonballs with both hands and hurling them at the French. "Well, Matveyevna, Matushka, little mother, don't betray us," he was just saying and starting away from the cannon, when back of him was heard a voice which he did not know. "Captain Tushin! Captain!" Tushin looked around in alarm. It was the same staff officer who had sent him out of Grund. In a quavering voice the officer cried, "Are you beside yourself? Twice you have been ordered to retire, and you—" "Now why do they bother me?" exclaimed Tushin to himself, looking with dread at the officer. I'm all right," he returned, raising 2 fingers to his visor. But the colonel did not say all that he meant to say. A cannon ball flying close to him cut him short and made him cower down close to his horse. He paused and was just going to repeat his order when still another cannon ball silenced him. He wheeled his horse round and galloped away. "Retire! All of you, retire!" he cried from the distance. The soldiers laughed. In a minute an adjutant came with the same order. This was Prince Andrei. The first thing he saw as he reached the little space occupied by Tushin's cannon was an unharnessed horse with a broken leg, neighing near his mates. From his leg the blood was spurting as from a fountain. Among the limbers lay a number of the killed. One cannonball after another flew over him as he galloped up, and he was conscious of a nervous tremor running down his back. But the mere thought that he was afraid again roused his courage. "I cannot be afraid," he said to himself, and he deliberately dismounted among the field pieces. He delivered his message, and still lingered in the battery. He resolved that the guns should be removed from their position and brought in under his direction. He and Tushin, stepping among the dead bodies, made the arrangements for limbering the cannon, even while the French were pouring a murderous fire upon them. "An officer just dashed up here, but he made himself scarce in no time," remarked a gunner to Prince Andrei. "He wasn't like your honor." Prince Andrei exchanged no words with Tushin. They were both so occupied that it seemed as though they did not see each other. When at last they succeeded in getting 2 of the 4 field pieces limbered, they started to descend the hill, leaving one field piece dismounted, together with the howitzer. Prince Andrei turned to Tushin. "Well, good-bye," said he, offering him his hand. "Good-bye, my dear," returned Tushin. "Dear heart, farewell, my dear fellow," exclaimed Tushin, the tears springing to his eyes, though he knew not why. End of chapter 20.